A major hang-up that a lot of newcomers to vampire spaces have when looking at the history of certain groups is the concept of castes. Most new vampires are introduced to the concept of the caste system through the work of Michelle Belanger in her Psychic Vampire Codex, where she delineates three categories of vampire meant to function together as a ritual trinity, but each with distinct characteristics and needs. The number 3 is important in many belief systems, both religious and magical, so it is no surprise that we see trinities showing up in many places. The thing about castes within vampire groups is that the archetypes don't seem to change much regardless of the group. I'll begin with a brief description of the castes within a few of the more commonly known systems, and then share my observations and opinions. In the Keprian system, the three castes are the priests, the warriors, and the counselors. One can probably tell, more or less, what their functions are by their names, but in a very abbreviated sense, the priests are the most adept at directing energy, the warriors provide stability and grounding, and the counselors facilitate the exchange of energy. There's much more that could be said about the intricacies of each caste, but that's beyond the scope of what I intend to examine here. What is not as widely known is that this sort of triple-caste system is not unique to the Keprian system, and it is also found within the clan Sabretooth structure. Within the most recent iteration of the Black Veils, the word caste has been replaced with the concept of the pulse, but the meaning is essentially the same, a category or archetype of vampiric expression. In the Sabretooth structure there is Ramket, the magician, Mradu, the warrior, and Kitra, the lover. These are roughly analogous to the Keprian castes of priest, warrior, and counselor. Something interesting that we will see going forward from here is that the counselor archetype analogs will often have suggestions of sensuality and sexuality associated with them. More on that later. Anyway, in the current of the Sabretooth legacy, as it is now being called, there are more pulses than the three previously mentioned, but these don't seem to be true castes as I'm discussing them here. The two additional pulses are Fred Samedi, the host, and Elarath the dragon. These seem to be specific to the current established by Father Sebastian, and while their addition makes sense if you are familiar with the evolution of Sebastian's current, they seem somewhat superfluous in their functions. Fred Samedi is the youngest pulse appearing after Hurricane Katrina, and it's unclear whether the pulse is actually something a vampire can embody in the caste sense, or simply some kind of spirit associated with the current. The Elarath are described as what amounts to priests of the current and are composed of other pulses. They take their name from the dragon archetype at the center of Sebastian's Black Veils philosophy. Given the focus of this essay is on the ubiquity of three caste systems, that is as deep as I'll be going into these other two pulses. This is probably a good time to mention that Temple House Sajaza uses the exact same names for their roads system, Ramket, Mradu, and Kitra. These are basically identical in function to the Sabretooth versions. It is even acknowledged that in the 1990s, the Sajaza used to refer to these as castes within their own organization. Whether Sajaza or Sabretooth came up with the names first, or if they both borrowed them from somewhere else, I can't say. Let's move on now to a lesser-known sect of vampires, the Aset Ka. Without dredging up too much old drama, one will note at a glance that the Aset Ka and the Keprians share similar Egyptian themes in their cosmology. Within the Asetian system, the castes or lineages are Viperines, concubines, and guardians. These roughly equate to priests, counselors, and warriors. This is what I was referring to earlier, that the very name concubine elicits themes of sensuality and sexuality. I'll leave any apologetics to the respective groups, but I thought it was an interesting observation, especially since it has shown up more than once. Each of the groups I've discussed thus far have different elaborations on their castes, but the overall flavor and function appears to the outside observer to be fundamentally the same. I'm sure there are many arguments to be had here, though. At this time, I would like to go a little deeper down the rabbit hole and touch upon fictional references to three caste systems. It is not a secret that the modern vampire community was heavily influenced by fiction and role-playing games in the development of aesthetic and structure. White Wolf's Vampire the Masquerade played a huge part in establishing the American community in the 1990s and thus continues to influence us right down to the present day. Bearing this in mind, I thought I would share a couple examples of clans within Vampire the Masquerade that have three caste systems. The first is the Banu Hakim. They have a warrior caste, a sorcerer caste, and a vizier caste. If we derive an archetype from the labels alone, it's remarkable how closely the castes of the Banu Hakim mirror the castes previously discussed in our real-world traditions. Of course, Vampire the Masquerade being a narrative role-playing game, the castes of the Banu Hakim are not as strictly defined. Another clan with a three-caste system within Vampire the Masquerade are the Salubri, with a healer caste, a warrior caste, and a watcher caste that has two subcastes. The Salubri castes are not as easy to map onto our real-world examples, but I thought it was worth noting simply to show that the concept of a three-caste system appears frequently, even within the same fictional game system that just so happens to have heavily influenced most aspects of the modern vampire community. I don't bring any of this up to suggest that one tradition stole the idea from another, although there are those that will make that exact accusation. I bring it up simply to show how ubiquitous it is within more spiritually or metaphysically inclined vampire traditions. It would not surprise me in the least if a similar system didn't exist in other traditions that I am not as familiar with. As I said before, the number 3 shows up a lot in religion, magic, folklore, and mythology, so it would only make sense for Trinities to continue to pop up within vampire traditions. The idea of castes is probably the more surprising thing here, rather than the number of them. In cultures where social castes are hereditary, castes are typically seen as immutable. You cannot rise beyond what you were born as. This seems antithetical to the fierce individuality that most vampires express, especially American vampires. In the caste systems of the traditions I've mentioned, the categories function more like archetypes that a person may fall into based on their natural inclinations, rather than something they are stuck as. There is even acknowledgement that most vampires are a mix of characteristics associated with different castes. It's just that most people tend to fall neatly into one or another. On that note of individuality, I should probably also state that outside of the aforementioned organizations, the castes have no validity or bearing at all, aside from being archetypes that one may use to describe themselves. The roles of each caste, or pulse, or road, or lineage are typically ritual or organizational functions within their respective organizations. One could even go so far as to say that they hold no bearing at all on a solitary or Ronin vampire. So yeah, there was no real great esoteric truth that I wanted to lay out for you here. I just so happened to have noticed some similarities over my years of studying various organizations and traditions, and thought I would set out my thoughts and observations for anyone else that may find these links interesting or who may want a history lesson. My sources for this video have been the first edition of the Psychic Vampire Codex by Michel Belanger, Black Veil's Master Vampire Edition 888V 2023 by Father Sebastian, Violet Throne, Legacy of the Aset Ka by Luis Marquez, and the Book of Secrets of Temple House Sajaza by Goddess Rosemary. I used the White Wolf Wiki for the Vampire the Masquerade clan information. If you find this kind of thing interesting or entertaining, then please like and subscribe. I have more planned for the future. Thank you.